Thanks, Jose. Got it. Okay, so thanks, Jose. And I forgot, I apologize for asking you the question when we had a hot mic. I forgot about that. Welcome, everybody. I put together some slides. I want to spend about 20 or 30 minutes going through those slides, which I think will give you a pretty broad overview of what we've got in DRA, and then leave time for you to ask questions and dig into specific things that you might or might not understand, or that I haven't covered at all or haven't explained well. And Jose is going to curate questions for me so that I don't have to try to pay attention to chat while we do this. So this first 20 minutes or 30 minutes or so, I'm going to move pretty quickly all the way through. You should have access to the slides. Part of the reason I wanted you to have access to the slides is at the bottom of many slides, there are links that you can access to find more information about whatever it is I'm talking about. And so I thought you might want to do that as well. So the one thing I'll add on this very first slide is actually, if after this presentation you have further questions, you can shoot me an email. But the better thing to do is shoot feedback at davesredistricting.org, and we all get that. And so, I monitor that, and everyone else on the team does as well. So I should actually share my screen. Let's try that first. Let's see, that's this one. All right, so you all should be able to see my screen. Jose, you can confirm that you can see my screen. Perfect. So again, this is my email, and you're welcome to use that. If you have questions after this session, you can always just send them to feedback at Dave's Redistricting, and the whole team gets that. So what I'm going to do is three things today. I'm going to very quickly talk about importing maps into DRA. If you want to look at what's going on in a particular state and you haven't found that information already posted somewhere, or I'll explain how to find it where it's posted. I'm going to talk about getting maps into DRA. I'm going to give you a quick high-level view of all of analytics, sort of the whole surface area of analytics, which is actually quite broad. And then I'm going to go fairly deep into the one topic that I think is probably most top of mind for people is how do you know whether a map favors one party or another? That's not the only consideration by far, but how do you know whether the degree which it's fair or favors one party or another? And I'll actually dig into that. It's a complicated subject. So that's what we're going to do. Let's talk about importing maps quickly. There's really two things you can do here. One is you can use plans that have already been imported into DRA, and there's two sources for that. One is in DRA, which I can show you hot here. And Jose, you can confirm you can now see DRA, right?
Yes, I can.
Perfect. Okay, so when you get into DRA, you don't have to be in DRA right now. Just follow me here. When you get into DRA, you can click on maps and you have the My Map section. I have a ton of maps because I do a lot of testing, but if you click on My Maps over here, there's an official maps collection. And this first thing that I'm talking about is that collection. So in that official maps collection are all the current maps, the ones that were in place in 2020, both the congressional maps and the state legislative maps for all states. And as maps have been adopted in this redistricting cycle, we are attempting to try to keep up with that. So as maps get added, we import them in and put them there for you. So you can go to that collection and search for particular maps that you're interested in. And chances are, if it's already been adopted, it'll be there or be there soon. If it's not a map that has been adopted yet, for many proposed maps and some other things, there's this other pretty interesting site called redistrict2020.org that has a bunch of different kinds of maps, and for a bunch of different tools as well. You have links to Plan Score for analysis. You have links to District Builder, I believe. So there's more than just DRA there. So those are ways to find maps that are already imported into DRA or some other tool. If you want to import plans yourself, there's really two ways. There's two things to know. One is you can either import what are called block assignment files. That's the preferred way. That's just a CSV, comma separated file that has GeoIDs for each of the many blocks, and then the district it's assigned to. That's the preferred way to do it because there's no ambiguity whatsoever about what block goes into what district. You can also import shape files or GeoJSON, and that's not quite as robust. It's fairly robust. It's not quite as robust because shapes can be a little wonky sometimes, but you can import either of those, and some states make one available, some states make the other available, some states make both available, and some states, just to be a pain in the ass, don't make either of those available, and they do stupid things like, make PDFs available, which are, so you have to redraw things by hand. But if you can find a block assignment file, a CSV or a shape file or a GeoJSON, you can import that straight into DRA. There's two different ways to do import, and this link down here at the bottom is an example of one of these bits of drill down you can do that I wanted to share. We have a top level import feature called import. Not surprisingly, that's a server-based thing, and because it's server-based, it can time out. We also have the ability to create a new map, and we have the ability to go in and use a feature within a map called an empty map called color map from file. That runs on your browser client, and so it won't time out. And so for bigger states like California or Texas, you might want to use the latter, or if the importing whatever you're importing, you get a failure on that, just try the second one. And both of those are described in importing maps. So lots of maps are there, lots of ways to get maps. Let me give you a quick tour of all of DRA. So this is the 1 inch deep, a mile wide tour of DRA. It's all the surface area, and I'm going to give you 5 different looks at it. So the first look or tab view is called the map tab, and this is where you actually draw maps. But there are actually interesting analytical capabilities in the drawing surface itself. And so you can see here a screenshot of a Michigan map that's colored using partisan colors. So so we've colored the districts here by partisan lean. So just in a very quick gestalt kind of way, you can take a look at a map and say, oh, this is mostly a red map. But there's some really concentrated blue in the southeast corner, and so it gives you a way to see partisan lean at a very granular, very coarse level. The other thing you may not notice here, but this, for example, is a community of interest that has been overlaid on top of the map, and so you can see this community of interest, which I believe is the Saginaw Chippewa Nation, is spanning districts 4 and 5 here. So you can see that reservation is getting split by 2 congressional districts, which is not ideal. And you can do that for the Native American tribes. We have all those communities of interest loaded into DRA, and you can do that for any other community of interest that you want to load up as a custom overlay. And so the 2 things I've shown here as further drill downs are how to color districts and precincts by partisan lean and other coloring schemes. That's the first link. The second one is drawing communities, and there's all about how to do that. And so very rich and powerful way. So the map surface is mostly about drawing maps, but there are actually some fairly significant analytical capabilities on that surface. And so I wanted to show you that. That's the first view. The second view is the statistics tab or statistics view. When you click on that, it shows you a table with 1 row per district, and then several sections of basic stats, so Excel-like stats for each district. And I've kind of squished it here to horizontally to fit it on the screen, but basically you have a population and deviation section here. So you can see the population that's been assigned each district and the deviations. This is obviously, highly equal. There's a section missing here about contiguity and donut hole districts that gives you green checks and red X's, depending on whether the districts are contiguous and free of holes. There's a partisan lean section here, which is about the degree to which a district is Democratic or Republican or votes third party other. And we do some of that partisan coloring here. Same, these ones in sort of the bluish are more heavily leaning Democratic. The red ones are more heavily leaning Republican, and the ones that aren't colored are in a zone between 45 and 55% two-party share. And that's critical here. You can see the reason this one's not colored is you had 3% other vote here. And so these colorings are based on two-party share, which is what we use in all our analytics. And then over on the right, and again, I've elided that, I've only shown a couple of columns, are demographics based on voting age population or citizen voting age population, if you pick that as a data set. So in addition to Hispanic, which is an ethnicity, and Black, you also have Asian, Pacific, and Native American demographic categories, which come from the census. And the last note here is about prisoner adjusted populations. In some states, depending on where you're working, like New York State or Maryland, Washington State as well, some states actually take the final official census data and then adjust it to move prison populations to their, where the people are from, not where they're in prison. And so we take that adjusted data when we have it, and we've loaded that in as an option as well. So you can pick between voting age data sets and citizen voting age data sets and prisoner adjusted, and et cetera, et cetera. You can pick between all of those kinds of things in the data selector, which I'll show you quickly here. If I go back to my maps, let me go back to my maps. And I'm just going to pick a Wisconsin congressional map that I happen to be looking at because of what's going on in Wisconsin. You can see the Native American tribes for Wisconsin are overlaid as a custom overlay here. And so they all show up on top of these congressional districts. And you can see, for example, here, that one is split by these two districts. The thing I want to show you is, I was just mentioning data sets. If you click on the gear in the upper right-hand corner, this section here called the data selector has the data set, shows you the data sets that are being used for this map. So I'm using the latest census data, which for this state is the 2020 population. For New York State, that might be the prisoner adjusted population, for example. I'm using the latest voting age population, but you can see I can choose citizen voting age population, or I can choose the voting age population that doesn't have Hispanics mixed into the race categories, a bunch of different options. And then we have an election composite, which is our default, but then there's individual elections that you can pick if you really know what you're doing, or you really want to look at just one specific election. You pretty much should know what you're doing. If you make that change, just use the composite if you're just trying to do basic analysis. So that's the statistics tab. Pretty simple. It gives you really interesting, back of the envelope kind of information about districts. The bottom line is mostly the statewide line. So this says that in the state of whatever this is that I'm using my sample, which is probably Michigan, there were 3.5% Hispanics statewide, and almost 14% Black. And then they were organized into these districts like this. So that's a second way to look at things. The third way to look at things, and I think the way that most folks who use DRA do their analysis, is the Analyze tab. And what it does is it analyzes the current map on 5 key dimensions, which are shown in this radar diagram: proportionality, competitiveness, the degree to which there's an opportunity for minority representation, compactness, and splitting. Each of those we could spend interesting little chunks of time talking about what does that mean, and what are the metrics behind those. We have all that described in these links here. If you want to go dig into that, it'll describe what the different dimensions are, what the metrics are that we use, and so forth. What we do for each of these dimensions is we have a section that shows you the raw values. These are the raw metrics, the REOC and Polsby-Popper, for people who are familiar with the compactness measures, those names will be familiar. I think these are the raw measurements, which mean nothing to nobody who's not an idiot savant. It's really hard to know how good or bad is a 0.35 REOC. So because it's really hard to know, what we've done is we've done the work to normalize those values between 0 and 100. So, and then we combine them together in an individual, single score for compactness and for each of these dimensions. So we're rating compactness here about a 44 out of 100. So these, are not terrible, but they're not great either. And what these metrics do together, these ratings, 0 to 100 ratings do together, especially when you look at multiple maps together, which I'll show you on the next slide, is they give you a gestalt for, again, this high level sense of a map and what the trade-offs are. This map is doing really well for minorities, but not so well on competitiveness or compactness or splitting, as an example. The notable maps, as you'll see in a slide, we have this notion of a notable map. So for all the published maps for a state and a kind of map, like all Wisconsin congressional maps or all Michigan congressional maps, we find the maps that score or rate the best on each of these 5 dimensions. And we call those notable maps. They're on the home page. So again, let me show you that. If you go to the home page, let's go to Michigan to be consistent. So here's the Michigan state page. That's the current congressional map, the current state Senate map, and the current state House map. Right below that, because we're looking at congressional maps, these are the 5 notable maps. This is the most proportional congressional map for 2020 congressional map for Michigan, drawn by anybody on DRA that's been published. Same with competitive, minority representation, compactness, and splitting. And so these maps are really interesting because when I go back here, I'll show you, let me show it to you. When you go back here, we let you compare the current map, this green one, to all of the 5 notable maps. And I'm only showing you one here, but I'll show you how that works in just a second. I'll come back to this. The last thing I want to say on this slide, which is really important, is this page is really useful because it gives you a really fast way to understand 5 of the most salient characteristics of a map, but it only shows things that you can quantify. And there are important characteristics and factors about maps that you might want to understand and consider when evaluating maps that aren't quantifiable or aren't so easily quantifiable. One of them is VRA analysis, and this minority dimension is absolutely not, what we do in that dimension is absolutely not VRA compliance. That's a very, very complicated thing to do. And we give you some basic ways to gauge the degree to which minorities are represented, might be represented well, but it's not VRA analysis. But there are other things that are very, very, very difficult to quantify, like communities of interest. You saw in that one of those previous slides that a Native American reservation was split by 2 districts. Well, that's a fact, but it's not a measurement that you can make more or less better with. And so how you handle communities of interest and what can be split and how split and which communities get split, that's very much of a judgment call. Same thing with incumbents and protecting and cores of existing districts. These and several other things simply aren't measurable in any easy way, at least yet. And so they don't factor into this page. And so that's something you need to understand. But all of those topics, how to analyze maps, how we rate things, and some of the interesting challenges in that, and the notable maps and how that all works, all of that's written up there. The fourth way I want to talk about, excuse me, I need a little drink. The fourth way I want to talk about, fourth view of analytics, the fourth sort of portal into the analytics capabilities in DRA that I want to talk about is the compare tab or compare view. And this is all about understanding the trade-offs between maps. And I'll do a little live demo of this in just a second because it's really helpful to see it live. But in a nutshell, what it does is it lets you by default compare the current map to all of those notable maps. So I'll show you that. It lets you compare ratings to all the similar maps. So these are all the similar published maps, and the black dots are the current map rating. So you can kind of see in a box plot format. So you can kind of see where the current ratings fare relative to the box plot and the quartiles and the median of all the other maps. And then it actually also does a really powerful thing and let you compare it to districts across time, which is really, really cool. So let me show you that. And to do that, let me go back to maps. Let me pick this map, which is a New York map. New York used to have 27 congressional districts in this redistricting phase. It only has 26 districts. And so one of the things you might want to do is compare a map drawn with 26 districts to the old map. And so if I do click on the compare button, I've already picked that old map. And so I can come down to here and I can compare these new districts to the old districts and see how much of each of these old districts, how much of these new districts is coming from the old districts. And then the other thing you can do, and we just released this last night, is you can actually add points of interest from overlays. And so what this map has done is added the incumbent addresses that this user got from RDH, actually, interestingly. I don't know, Jose, you probably haven't even seen this yet, but one of the things RDH has for some states is the addresses for incumbents. You can convert those into GeoJSON points or feature, JSON points, geo points, and then as an overlay, and then you can add them in so you can see which districts, like this district 18 actually has 2 current incumbents in it. And these districts here don't have any current incumbents in it. So the district boundaries for this district are pairing up current incumbents and then vacating certain districts. So that is a really powerful way to look at sort of districts across time. The other thing I want to show you here is, let's go back to this. Let's find a Michigan map to look at here. I think I can use this one, but let's find out. This is a map that I used when I was talking to the Common Cause folks. I'm going to come in here and look at the compare function. And you notice up in the right-hand corner, I've picked compare notables. So I'm comparing this map to all 5 notables. And unlike that New York map where I was picking just one map to compare to, now I'm comparing it to 5 maps, those notable maps. So these notable maps, the orange ones, you see the green one is the same each time. That's this current map. These orange maps in these pairwise comparisons are the 5 maps that rate best on each of those 5 dimensions. So this is the most proportional map. This is the most competitive map. This is the best minority map, the one that gives the minorities the most opportunity for representation. This is the most compact map, and this is the least splitting map. And you can see how the map that I'm looking at fares relative to each of those maps. And I actually want to, which is really powerful, I want to show you how incredibly useful that is. So let's do this, for example, and I want to show you this. I want to show you this, the current Wisconsin map, which if you're following the news, the proposal in Wisconsin is to simply use the maps that were in place in 2020. And so if I go look at, so this is that map, the map that was in place in 2020 relative to the notable maps. What you can see is this map, the current map, the 2020 map, is basically, you can make it better on multiple dimensions in all maps but this one. So basically the most proportional map, the one that treats minorities the best, the one that is most compact, and the one that has least splitting. Of all the maps that were published by DRA users, the best map in each of those 4 dimensions is as good as or better than the current map on every one of those dimensions. And so we hope that when the Wisconsin State Supreme Court gets to taking and tweaking the current map, which they admit that they might do based on communities of interest, or they might have to do based on state and federal law, to address compactness and splitting, that they might look at some of these kind of characteristics. So that's the compare tab. And then finally, and this is a good segue into the last section, the third section, we're getting close to opening up for questions, is an advanced tab. And these tabs that I'm talking about, so here's the map. When you're looking at a map, these tabs are in the upper right corner. So I started in the map tab. We talked about statistics. There's an analyze tab. There's a compare tab, which we just talked about. And then there's an advanced tab. When you click on that advanced tab, this is intended for experts. It doesn't mean you can't go there, but we do almost nothing here to try to help you understand what you're looking at. And I say that not to be rude, I say that not to be cheeky or anything. It's just that this is stuff that experts, when experts look at this, experts go here, they know what they're doing, they know what these measures mean, they know how these measure, when they work and when they don't work, and they know how to compare different measures, and et cetera, et cetera. So it's pretty complicated, and I don't want to discourage you in any way from trying to learn what you need to learn to make use of what's on this tab, and I'm going to show you a few things that are interesting. But it's unlike the Analyze tab, which is intended for everyone. This is really intended for experts. So you've got to know what you're doing when you're on this tab. It does show you really interesting things, which I've got on this slide, but let me just show it to you. Let me just show it to you live. So the very first thing on this advanced tab is what's called a rank votes graph. And this ranks the districts in increasing Democratic vote share, and what this from left to right, and what that shows you is the angle between all these ones that are going to go Republican and these ones that are going to go Democratic, and that angle is called declination, and that's a measure of asymmetry, which is really helpful to help identify a partisan gerrymandering technique called packing. This is some evidence of packing. The next section, which you could either navigate with this nav bar up here, or you can just scroll up. This is called a seats votes curve, which is a really powerful way to understand how the seats that different parties get in a, let me try to move this over here so you can see how the vote share statewide translates into seat share. And again, is another really powerful technique, which I'll talk a little bit more in a second about how to interpret the degree to which maps are fair or not. Then you have a whole section of advanced metrics, these things called seat bias, votes bias, declination, which I've talked about, other ones called global symmetry and gamma. These are all things that experts know what they're talking about. You've probably heard about efficiency gap. That's a relatively easy one to understand, which I'll talk about more in a second. There's some more ones that, again, experts know what they're doing. Because I'm logged in as me, I have access to some experimental metrics, so you can just ignore those. And then there's some interesting stuff which came out of University of Michigan, John Aguia, which helps you understand the role of political geography in a state, where different kinds of people who tend to vote Democratic, people who tend to vote Republican, where they live, and what that tends to contribute to the sort of inherent bias in a state called political geography. And we have some metrics here that help you understand how much of the bias in a map comes from the underlying geography and how much comes from how you tweak the boundaries of the map. There's some responsiveness measures. There are some measures to help you do racially polarized voting. This is not ecological inference, but it's similar. This was done with Stephen Ansel-Abaher at Harvard. And we have compactness by district, which you need in some federal court cases. And then we have a way to analyze community splitting by community. And so these are the Native American tribes in Wisconsin we're looking at here. And you can see that these pieces of Native American land, these one reservation and these two trust lands were split. And it gives you some metrics developed by Sam Wong and collaborators, recently published in the Stanford Law Review. So lots and lots of information on this advanced tab that you really know what you're doing. The Analyze tab, pretty straightforward and easy to understand what's going on. Compare is really useful to compare to notable maps, and then the Advanced tab. So that's the second thing, and just really quickly, sort of a tutorial, and then we can open up for questions. This last little bit here is, you saw in that Advanced tab, there were literally, a dozen or so metrics that are all in and around, I'm going to air quote this, the notion of bias. And so it begs the question, well, how do you know which one should you look at? What if they disagree? If one says, things are in favor of Democrats and the other says you should favor Republicans, the metrics say that, which ones do you look at? So I'm going to give you a quick primer on that, because it's pretty hard to get through that. Excuse me, it can be confusing. It's actually pretty easy to get through that, but it's confusing when you're just looking at everything. So here it is fairly simply. So I'm going to use a term that I call partisan advantage, just to not use the words bias and partisan bias, both of which have meanings as terms of art in jurisprudence and in academic articles. And so to not be confusing, I'm just going to say, let's call this advantage. And advantage is simply the difference between how many seats you should get ideally. If you get 55% of the seats, how many, what percentage, if you get 55% of the votes statewide, a party does, Democrats or Republicans, what percentage of the seats should they get? And you have to have some notion of what the ideal is. It might be 1-to-1, or it might be 2-to-1 over 50%. That's what the efficiency gap embodies, but you have to have some notion of what that ideal is. And then you have to have some way to estimate what you're likely to get based on the statewide vote share. And that's what we do automatically for you in DRA. And what I'm defining as the advantage, the degree to which a map favors one party or another, is simply the difference between those two things. If the Democratic seat share will be bigger than the Democratic vote share, then that is an advantage for the Democratic Party, and vice versa for Republicans. And the reason I do it, I talk about it as straightforward and simply, and you might argue as baldly as I do, is seats are political currency. That's what parties care about. That's what makes up the delegation that goes to Washington, and it's what makes up who controls Congress. So seats are political currency. And we do this around the two-party statewide vote share, and we use Democratic vote shares by convention. We could use Republican. It's just 1-. It's the same thing. So let me show you some examples. This slide is basically an inventory of all of the metrics that were on that Advanced tab that I showed you, and plus the proportionality metric that was on the Analyze slide. 3 of these metrics, declination, lopsided outcomes, and mean median difference, are really interesting. They don't measure advantage as I've defined it. They measure asymmetry, which is a partisan gerrymandering technique. And so they help you understand the degree to which partisans, one party has been packed by the other party. So if Republicans are drawing, it helps you understand the degree to which Republicans might have packed Democrats for advantage, Democratic leaning voters for advantage. If it might have been in Maryland, it would tell you the degree to which the Democratic Party might be packing Republicans for partisan advantage. So these don't directly tell you who has advantage. They help you understand when a technique has been used. So they're interesting, and that declination, the ranked votes graph, is super powerful visually, but it doesn't really tell you advantage. These next 4, seat bias, votes bias, partisan bias, and global symmetry, are all fairly famous in the academic writing about how do you know when a map is biased or not. What's interesting about them, so they have great pedigrees, but what's interesting about them is they become unreliable when the statewide vote share in a state is unbalanced. And what I mean by that is, in a state where the Democratic vote share is, say, 60%, or the Republican vote share is 60%, these become unreliable indicators of bias, and they actually send the wrong signal. I'll tell you that. I'll show you that in a minute. These measures are actually reliable across the full range of vote shares. Proportionality is simply the degree to which the seat share is different than the vote share. The ideal embodied in that is that votes should translate into seats directly 1-to-1. Efficiency gap uses a 2 times winners bonus. And so that says if you get 55% of the seats, you should get, of the votes, you should get 60% of the seats. So 55 minus 50 gives you a 5% difference. And then you get 2 times that is what the efficiency gap says. And then there's a more complicated measure called gamma, which I think you can safely ignore. But basically, each of these is a reliable measure of advantage as I've defined it. And they just differ based on the ideal winners bonus, which is this thing called R. And let me just show you how to find that quickly, because I'm going to use it on the next few slides quickly. If you go to the advanced tab, in the responsiveness section, there are 3 measures here. And this last one, overall responsiveness, you'll see the description says overall responsiveness or winner's bonus. That is the capital R that I'm using in this slide. And so the winner's bonus for implied by proportionality is 1. In other words, every percent you get every additional percent you get in votes, you should get an additional percent in seats. Efficiency gap, it uses a 2 times winners bonus. So I'm just going to do a couple of quick examples to illustrate what I just said, and then I'll be done and we can take questions. So here's a seats votes curve, that really cool curve I talked about for the Illinois 2020 congressional map. The convention in DRA in lots of analysis is that positive measures that have a positive sign indicate Republican bias. Measures that have a negative sign indicate Democratic bias. There's no value associated with these. We could easily flip them. We could easily flip all these things. So it doesn't matter that I'm using Democratic vote shares, and it doesn't matter that I've associated plus and minus. So we can easily flip them. The reason I want to show you this is the seats bias and the votes bias are these 2 things that show up on the seats votes curve down here. And they indicate for this map, they have positive signs. So they say this map is biased in favor of Republicans. Similarly, same with the partisan bias and global symmetry, which I won't try to explain here. But this is a map where Democrats got basically almost 60% of the vote, and they got just over 2 times winners bonus. So the efficiency gap is small, but it's showing Democratic bias. The proportionality bias or advantage is between this line of proportionality, the 45 degrees, and where it crosses the statewide vote share. This is a statewide vote share there. That's about 11%. So both of these indicate Democratic bias. It was a state that leans heavily Democratic from a statewide vote share, and Democrats drew the plan. So this is very clearly a democratically biased plan. But these 4 fairly high profile metrics actually get confused. And the reason they get confused is this blue statewide seats vote share is actually below the line of proportionality to the left of the statewide vote share, and then it flips up above it by the time it gets to the statewide vote share. So that's why these are things you can look at, and these you got to be careful about. When this statewide vote share is close to 50%, these are fine. When it gets farther away from 50%, they get confused. This is a complementary example in Texas, which is leans very heavily Republican, and Republicans drew the map. Everyone knows that they were trying to get advantage out of it. Again, seats bias and votes bias show, weirdly, they show Democratic bias, even though when you look at the actual number of seats likely to be won and these other measures, it's very clearly a Republican bias map, and proportionality and efficiency gaps show that. And then one final map just to illustrate this R point is the Colorado 2020 congressional map. You can again see that the statewide vote share was about 55% Democratic. This dashed or dotted line here is the line of proportionality where seats equals votes. This dashed one sort of underneath the blue seats votes curve is where the efficiency gap is 0. That's got a responsiveness of 2. And you'll see that the seats votes curve passes just underneath that at the statewide vote share. It gives you a winner's bonus of just less than 2. And what I'm showing in this graphic here, and then I'll be done, is when the winner's bonus is between 1 here and 2 here, when it's between those two areas, what the efficiency gap is saying is that map is not biased according to the efficiency gap. So in this region here between those two lines, the efficiency gap says it's not biased. It'll give you a number that says it's biased. I think the raw number here is, I could find it for you. The raw number says it's biased in favor of Republicans, but it's actually what you do when the winner's bonus is between 1 and 2 inclusive. Just treat the efficiency gap as saying it's an acceptable amount of bias. So that's a quick run through. I'll open it up for questions, and we'll go from there. Jose, what can I help people understand, or what can I help people show?
Awesome. Thank you so much, Alec. So what we're going to do right now is I'm going to read off questions that are in the chat.
Okay.
If you have any questions, folks, please type your question in the chat, or you could put the word stack in the chat, sort of like how I'm doing it here, if you would like to unmute yourself and ask a question. But I'm going to start off with reading off questions that we already have on here. So Aaron asks, what races/years are used to calculate partisan lean?
Partisan lean. Okay, so let me just go get a map here to look at. I always like looking at North Carolina. Let's look at North Carolina. It's always a fun one. This is a copy of the North Carolina 2020 map. So let's go look at that. So I think you're asking when you've got, well, you could be asking two things. We actually use the term partisan lean here. You could be asking for these data right here, what elections are used, or you could be asking for any place we do calculations about all these partisan analytics, what election data are we use? And the answer is the same in both cases. So let me answer the general. What we use, there's two ways to sort of understand what we use, two different places you can find the info. One is if you go to the map, then you click on the upper right-hand corner in the gear icon, there's these data sets. This is called a data selector. And this is, if you have read-write privileges to a map, you can choose to use different data sets for whatever reason. So if the analysis is that you're doing is that you want to look at the 2019 ACS estimates or total population estimates, or you want to use CVAP because you're doing Hispanic analysis as opposed to racial analysis, or you want to look at a particular election, you can come here. So the first thing is for the particular map, you can click this up, you can see this, and it says this is using the composite of 2016 to 2020. It doesn't tell you what's in that composite, but which I'll show you how to find that information in a second. But it tells you you're using that composite, and it tells you all the other individual elections that you could pick individually. If you want to know what's in that composite for this map or any other state, go back to the top level and then click on, let's see, where is it? Oh, click on About Data here, and then click on Election Data. And then for each state, there's a 2020 column and a 2010 column. You want to look in the 2020 column if you're using a map that uses the official 2020 shape. So if I go down to North Carolina, since that was the map I had open, let's find North Carolina. lots of data here. So here's the North Carolina data. So those are all elections that we have at our disposal. The ones that have an asterisk by them are the ones that are used in the election composite. Okay. And I don't know, actually, let me do this for you live. I don't know if I had this link on the slides, but if I didn't, and you go to our Medium site, there's a post called Election Composite, which has all the details about how we take those elections that are have asterisks with them and composite them together into the election composite. Does that answer the question?
I believe so. If Aaron, okay, great. Aaron says yes.
Perfect.
And I just put in the chat the link that.
Oh, great. Yeah, and I wasn't sure if that was on the slide. Let me go see if it was on the slides here. What's the next question?
Great. Shonda asks, can you elaborate more on the prisoner adjusted feature and benefits / disadvantages of employing?
Sure, that's a good question. So let me just show it to you really quickly. So let's do New York here. Let's use this New York map again. So the feature, such as it is the ability to pick a data set that is prisoner adjusted. So this is a New York map. I'm going to go back to clicking on the gear icon, which gets you to all the settings about a map. In the data selector, there's these 3 different data sets that you can choose different ones of. So the prisoner adjusted data is part of the census. It's a census option. So what this is saying is for New York, and it differs state by state depending on what data we have, because not all states have prisoner adjusted data, and I'll talk about why ones do and what it means for you. What this says is you can choose to use the latest, and I'm air quoting that on purpose because that's just a pointer to one of these other data sets. One of these is bound to latest. I'll show you that in a minute. And then you can pick any one of these specifically and say, you know what, I want to go look at this using the total population from the last census, the 2010 census. So that, that's kind of interesting. If you draw new maps and you want to look at the old census data, that'll tell you, how the old population worked in that new map. That's an interesting scenario. But I'm just going to click latest here, and then underneath it, you see that it says latest equals total population 2020. Okay, so what that means is that latest isn't using this total population adjusted. I could make it that if I wanted. And so if I come back here and look at this, you see that I'm specifically using the total population adjusted data, the prisoner adjusted data. And the reason that it's available at all, and the reason to use it if it's available, and this is an interesting asterisk on that, is that when it is available, it is typically because it is required by state law to be used. So I don't know about New York, but I know about Maryland. So Maryland has a state law that says for redistricting, you have to use the prisoner adjusted data. So, as it becomes available, we ingest it and make it available. And when it is what you have to use for a kind of map, it becomes the default for that map. It becomes latest. And I guess the reason that it is not the default for New York congressional is that it's not required by state law. It must be required for this, the state assembly or the state senate. So it's available there, but not chosen by default for New York congressional maps. I'm guessing if I opened a New York, state assembly map, it would be there by default. Does that make sense? And I'm sorry, let me just say one more thing. So to make life difficult for us and you, it is unfortunately not the case that when prisoner adjusted populations are sometimes required for some kinds of maps in a state, they're not required for all kinds of maps in that state. Sometimes it's for all maps in a state, but But sometimes some states don't have prisoner adjusted data at all. Some states require prisoner adjusted data for all kinds of maps. And then to make life difficult, some states require prisoner adjusted data for some kinds of maps, but not all kinds of maps. And so you have to sort of pay attention to what's required in a particular state. And we've tried to make those choices automatic, but you can override them if you want.
Shonda says, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Next question is from Don. Will DRA have a way of counting municipal splits in the near future?
Well, depending on what you mean, like, can you just ask him to clarify? Does he mean like cities? Does he want to know when cities are split?
Cities, villages, or townships.
Yeah, it's a great question. So let me show you what Don is asking about. So I went on purpose, partly because I didn't have a lot of time, and partly because I wanted to give you a little bit of a tutorial on understanding how to evaluate partisan advantage. I only showed you the Analyze tab and only said that there were these 5 dimensions, one of which is splitting. So if you click on splitting, what it shows you is some good analysis on the degree to which counties and districts have been split by a map. And then underneath that, we do some counting of that. And then I'm getting to answering your question, Don. I've also showed you, let's see if I've showed it to you here. No, let me show it to you again quickly here. So this is the common cause map. On the common cause map, or actually, let me show you, it was on the Wisconsin map that I showed you this. On the Wisconsin map, there were all the state tribes. We had loaded those in as a custom overlay, so we could see how these tribal areas were affected by maps. On the advanced tab, there's this community splitting thing. I can then analyze those, and I can see how the different tribal areas have been split. What Don is asking about, which is a great question, and we've heard it before, is, hey, you have all of these on this map here. You have this way to show all the cities. So I'm going to get rid of, let me see, what do I want to get rid of? These are the, well, these actually are the cities in Michigan. These are pretty small. And what he's asking about is, hey, I'd love to know if any of those units are split in the same way that you do the kind of splitting analysis for counties or the splitting analysis for communities of interest, because all else equal, you want each of these entities in a district. So that's the question. That's a great question. We might be able to get to that. It presents some challenges, as you can see here, Don, because there are a lot of what I'm going to air quote as cities, what are considered cities in some states like this one, and it just presents some challenges computationally and from a user interface perspective. So I will the good news for you is I will definitely make note that we've been asked about this, and I will upvote it in our backlog. We have a backlog of things we might try to do, and I will upvote it based on your question. But we don't currently do it right now, but you can obviously see when they're split by turning on district lines, but it's not nearly as nice as having them pointed out for you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Connie asks, do you know how soon proposed maps get uploaded onto Redistrict 2020?
I don't. And it's all props to them for doing that site. It's actually quite an interesting site, but they seem to have fallen behind a little bit, which is why we started adding things to the official maps collection. Which again, if you go back to the list of maps, and then click on official maps, we started adding these. So if I show you the ones that are the latest ones, these are ones that we've added recently. And so there's a project at the Daily Coast, combination of Daily Coast and Plan Score are keeping track of all the adopted maps. And when maps get adopted and there's a indication there that they get adopted, we're now adding them into DRA. And so you should be able, unless we run into some difficulty or can't do it for some reason that I don't really understand why, as soon as something that could be ingested is available and the Daily Coast folks and Plan Score folks know about it, we'll get notified and then we'll import it. So hopefully within a day or two, it will show up here. So I would just keep track on this. You can just go to the official maps, sort it by modified and see what's the latest there. Or you can also, I think I put this in the slides. I didn't put it in the slides. So let me give Jose another thing to show you here. If you do filtering, sorting maps, this post is really cool because it shows you how to do things like I'm going to do. You already see me do this once, but if I want to look at, well, I don't know what state you're interested in. If you're looking at, if you want to see, does Massachusetts have any maps, that are unofficial, and you can search on the state, you can search on the 2020 cycle versus the 2010 cycle, you can search on the type of map, you can search on these labels here, you can search on owner. You can search on all kinds of things. And so it's a really powerful way to search. And that is really cool when you're looking at published maps, of which there are 20,000 here. So you can, if you find people that you really like to follow, like Brian Amos is a pretty high-end mapper, you might want to come in here and just search on Brian Amos and see all his maps. Or you want to look at all the maps for a particular state or all, whatever. You can find those all using those search capabilities, which is pretty cool.
We have time for one more question. Shonda asks, can you explain more about notable maps? Who develops those? Which are the best ones to use to compare? Are there suggested notables to commonly use?
What was the last piece? Are there suggested notables to what?
To commonly use.
I'm sorry, I still not getting that. What's the last word? Common what?
Are there suggested notables, like notable maps to commonly use?
Oh, commonly used. Sorry, it was that last little bit that I was missing. Well, let's go look at notable maps. So this again is the Medium post, which is pretty interesting. Maybe I'll just work here because I can actually show it to you live, but I'll work here. So the thing to know about notable maps, it's a great question for a number of reasons. The thing you will note about notable maps, pun intended, is there is no overall best map here. We very consciously chose not to anoint one as what we think is the best map. And the reason is there's several reasons. I'll just try to enumerate them. One is, as I mentioned when I was doing the quick tour of all the different analytics capabilities, is the only things we quantify that we rate are things that can be quantified. If you can't quantify it, there's no rating for it. And so there are things that are interesting about maps that you might want to consider in evaluating maps that can't be quantified easily, like community splitting, like, to Don's question, are all the cities in Michigan, are those split, or, are any of those split or not split, or what about the tribal areas, or, what about historically African-American areas, or whatever, there's a lot of things like that that are easy to see, but they're easy to describe, but they're not easy to quantify. So the things that we rate are only things that can be quantified. That's number one. Number two is there's very strong, wide spectrum of beliefs about the relative importance of these dimensions. So like, even if you think these are the only 5 things you should care about, which is a lot of people would say, no, that's not true. There's lots of other things you should care about or could care about that you need to factor in. But even if you thought these were the only 5 things to care about, there's a wide range of well motivated opinion about the relative importance of these things. So, for example, how do you trade off the degree to which a map is fair to political parties versus a map that is fair or gives minorities the greatest opportunity to select representatives of their choice? That's a really hard thing to know. How do you trade off, the degree to which a map is proportional, fair, to the degree to which it's competitive. Maybe it's super fair, but there's zero competition, because the districts that are going to go for Republicans, or there's no question that they're going to go for Republicans, and the districts that are going to go for Democrats, there's no question they're going to go for Democrats. But it's very fair. How do you, different people weigh those criteria differently. And then, some people think you shouldn't have political considerations in maps at all. And, that you should only look at what I'm going to air quote here as traditional, or what they think of as neutral opinions or criteria like compactness and splitting. Should only look at those things. Now, I happen to be of the school that says there's nothing that's neutral, because, and there's another really useful Medium post here, which I highly encourage you, if you're just getting into this, to read. And it's intentionally provocative in the title. And the more elaborated title or statement is that compact districts aren't always fair. They aren't always unfair either, but they are frequently unfair, and they are frequently unfair because of the urban-rural sort, where Democratic-leaning people have self-sorted into dense urban cores, and Republican-leaning people have stayed in more diffuse rural areas. And that tends to, this notion of political geography that I mentioned, that tends to mean that the political geography of many states is advantageous to Republicans. So if you drew perfectly compact districts in there, those districts would actually be advantageous for the Republicans. And I actually show you examples in this Medium post and describe that. And so nonetheless, some people think you shouldn't have political considerations in redistricting at all, because I think they think that means that they're fair. But I show you in this post that's not true. I think you can't not have political considerations in redistricting. You have to consider it. So it really comes down to what you value, and so we put these here. And so, just to sort of wrap up back to the original question, which ones of these you look at depends on how you think about these questions of, what's most important. And the last vignette I'll tell you is the Fair Districts folks in PA actually looked at a couple of these, and then they had some other criteria that they, so they made their own rubric, if you will. And they said, well, we're going to look at these 2 dimensions that they rate, and then we're going to look at these other 2 or 3 things that they cared about. And one of those was the specific way that Pennsylvania requires you to think about splitting counties and things like that, which would kind of get back to Don's thing. So, you can come at this from lots of different perspectives and lots of levels of detail. This is a good gestalt way to kind of understand, especially when you look at that comparison feature that I showed you, when you come here and you look at, the comparison feature, and you're looking at these 5 maps, looking at a map. This is the current Wisconsin one, which might get adopted for the next 10 years. And you look at the compare feature, you can compare it to all 5 notables just with a click of a button. And we just show you that given the political geography of a state, you can make a map that is better on every dimension than the current one. It's more proportional, it's more compact, it's less splitting. This one is a little bit better on competitiveness, not quite as good on proportionality. And so, it just shows you that, the political geography of a state admits the ability to create maps that are better on all these dimensions. And then it's really up to you to decide, what dimensions are important for you, and what things these don't measure are important considerations that you might trade some of this off for. So it's a complicated question.
Awesome. Shonda says, thank you so much. This was very informative. Appreciate your time and expertise.
You're welcome.
Great. So we are out of time. Let me go ahead and